Welcome to the San Francisco Writers Conference podcast, a celebration of craft, commerce, and community. I'm your host, Matthew Felix, and I'm here today with Jasmin Darznik. Jasmin is the New York Times best-selling author of Song of a Captive Bird. She is also the author of The Good Daughter, a memoir of my mother's hidden life, and the forthcoming The Bohemians, which we will be talking about today. Jasmin's books have been published in 17 countries. I am so jealous. And her essays have appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times. Jasmin holds an MFA in fiction from Bennington College and a PhD in English from Princeton University. She is also professor of English and creative writing at California College of the Arts. Welcome, Jasmin.
Hello, Matthew.
Nice to see you. Nice to have you here. Thanks for being here. We're so close yet so far away, but it's nice to see you on the other side of the screen. So let's just jump right into The Bohemians. Can you tell us what the book is about?
Sure. So The Bohemians is the coming of age of Dorothea Lange, one of our great American artists, photographers. And it's also the coming of age of San Francisco, set in the 1920s in the city. It's a story about friendship, and it's a love letter to San Francisco in the Jazz Age.
Okay. So your last book, Song of a Captive Bird. I got that right. Song of a Captive Bird was about a strong, trailblazing woman poet, Farrukhzad. Did I say that right? My Farsi is so rusty.
It's been a while since we talked.
And it's been a while since I've had to say it. Yeah. So my initial assumption when I saw that you had written about Dorothea Lange, another strong, trailblazing, creative woman, was that was sort of intentional, that was where you had gotten the idea for this book. But it turns out that wasn't actually the case. There was something else that was sort of the starting point for the book. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I fell in love with a building. I fell in love with a place called Montgomery Block. I had never heard of this, even though I'd grown up in the San Francisco Bay Area. I was teaching at USF, and one of my students was writing a nonfiction piece about this place called Monkey Block. And so that was my first point of connection. It was an artist colony in its 100-year history in San Francisco. It had housed about 800 artists and writers of all stripes. And it stands where now the Transamerica Pyramid is. So it was torn down in the 50s, but once it had been this wondrous haven for artists in San Francisco. So I fell in love with this place, and I just knew I had to write about it. And then I started scouting around to see who had intersected with it.
Right. And one of those people obviously was Dorothea Lange. So how did you go from, because you just said there were 800 people, 800 artists, writers, photographers. Yeah. So out of that 800, how did you narrow it down to Dorothea and realize this is who I want to focus my story on?
Yeah, it's honestly, it's like falling in love, partly I can't explain it, but then on the other hand, I have a certain type. I'm really drawn to women who are independent, who are self-made. My book, Song of a Captive Bird, was about a woman poet who was very much the heroine of her own life. And Dorothea Lange, some people know about her work during the Depression, but Dorothea Lange was a polio survivor. She was disabled by polio and came to San Francisco in 1918 with nothing. She was robbed the day she got here. And I think that was something that really hooked me. It was just, so stunning to think, how had this woman built a life for herself and even survived, much less thrived, coming from so far away. She'd come from the East Coast, and within a year of landing here, she was one of the best known photographers in the city, portrait photographer at the time.
Right.
But there was a story there, and I had to figure out parts of it and imagine the rest of it.
And we're going to talk about that. But before we talk about that, it's the story, the book isn't just about Dorothea. It's specifically, or more specifically, it's also about her assistant, Caroline, and their relationship. Yeah. So who was Caroline, first of all? And then why did you decide that you wanted the story to be also largely about their relationship?
Yeah. So I think when you write historical fiction, you have to bring something to the story that history can't tell. So as I started to learn about Dorothea, as fascinating as she was, when I came across a mention of her Chinese American assistant, a woman who had been there with her from the beginning at her studio at 540 Sutter Street in San Francisco, there was just the briefest of mentions of this woman. But I thought there was something there. I just felt that relationship would have been charged and valuable to them both. And I think I also got, also partly it was that no one had bothered to ask this woman's story.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
just no one had gone to the trouble of finding out who she was. And as a novelist, that's fantastic because then I can sort of enter and imagine it. But I became so interested in the relationship between these two women. And in the novel, she's a mixed race woman. Now we would call it, at the time, they would have called her a half breed. She's half Chinese. She's, doesn't quite know her full parentage, her full story, but she is, in my telling, she's absolutely essential to Dorothea's emergence as an
Right.
artist.
Right. Something that brings them together, and I think is sort of foundational for their friendship, is this notion of not wanting to be seen. This is
Yeah.
something that initially brings them together. And this idea of being seen, not being seen, different angles on that theme runs throughout the book in lots of different ways. And we're going to talk about a few different ways in which it does. But let's start with this notion of not being seen. Both Dorothea and Caroline don't want to be seen for different reasons. Can you speak to that briefly?
Sure. I love that you picked that up because it was definitely, it's something that I felt as I was writing it, but sometimes you don't quite know what the book's about. And it
Right.
was kind of late into the game when I realized it's very much a book about being seen, unseen, who's unseen, how can we make each other seen. And so Dorothea Lange, I think part of her preoccupation as a woman, as an artist, came from having had polio when she was young. When she was 8 years old, she got polio, and she spent a year at home. And when she returned to school, she was mocked and ridiculed and called all kinds of names, because she walked with a limp afterwards. And she had an insecurity, I think, about her body that never quite, even though she accomplished great things, she had a certain, that was a traumatic event and it had marked her. And I think it also created great empathy in her. I think she was always really drawn, to people who were outsiders, who were alone, who were not seen, by the communities around them.
Right.
And then as for Caroline, as a Chinese woman, she could not walk down the streets without eyes being on her, getting stared down. Also, from for very complicated reasons, there's also an association between Asian women and prostitution that was in place in San Francisco at the beginning of the century. And so she's also looked at in a lascivious way. She's forever the object of either, a certain fantasy or demonization as an Asian woman.
Right. And let's talk just really briefly about, there are some specific examples. I thought that I had a okay sense of the history of racism in this country. I mean, it's so rich, unfortunately. I don't claim to know it all, but there were a few things in this book that really surprised me that I didn't know anything about, specifically related to the treatment of Chinese in San Francisco in the 20s. There are a
Mhm.
few stunning examples of what they were subjected to, what Caroline was subjected to, beyond what you said sort of day to day. Do any of those come to mind, some of the laws and things that were in place with regards to what they could and could not do?
Well, for one thing, they couldn't live where they wanted to. They were confined to, essentially it was a ghetto. Our current day Chinatown is exactly the dimensions that it was then. That was the only part of the city, by the way, in 1906, when the earthquake hit and the fires decimated the city. The Chinese were the only group of people in San Francisco who were segregated. And there was talk at that time of actually moving them down to the South Bay, um, close to the airport, where the airport is now.
Hmm.
And so there had been a long history of discrimination, of, um, of a real, of a really deeply seated racism against the Chinese, even though they had come over to build the country. They built the railroads, but they were not wanted. And there were, in the 1880s, there was a law passed that forbade Chinese women from immigrating. So that was one of the legal
Obstacles.
obstacles they faced as a community. That was to prevent families essentially from people creating roots for themselves in
Right.
America.
Right.
And then the Chinese Exclusion Act, which then made it very problematic, extremely difficult for people to immigrate. And in 1924, you have the first essentially racially based immigration quotas. And those are very much, though it's a national law, it very much came from California, and the sort of the yellow peril and the white nationalism that was burgeoning in the 1920s
Right.
is very much alive in California.
Right. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. The other thing I just wanted to mention, in addition to not being able to go into a lot of establishments, I
Mhm.
mean, they couldn't even go into a lot of establishments. Hospitals wouldn't admit them.
Yes.
Hospitals wouldn't admit the Chinese, which is just incredible. So let's go back though to this. That was sort of a side note with regards to what Caroline deals with and why she didn't want to be seen, right? So let's go back just quickly to that theme, because Caroline learns a trick relative to not being seen, and she shares this trick with Dorothea. Do you know what I'm referring to? Can you share that?
I feel like I should read the book more
No,
carefully.
you knew this wasn't going to be easy. No, but there's a way that she deals with not being seen that she helps Dorothea do the same.
I mean, I think she creates a persona for herself is maybe what
So
I
I'm
think.
going to help you with this one. I'm going to help you with this one. And like you said, you need to read the book, reread the book. But I really liked this quote. What Caroline was teaching me
Yeah.
was how to be free, which depended on knowing how to make yourself disappear.
Hmm.
So I really found that sort of fascinating, that
Yeah.
notion of finding freedom through not being seen. So can
Yeah.
you just speak to that a little bit?
Oh,
I
absolutely.
found that really salient.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, something that I found so interesting when I was reading about Lang is how, as a woman, she was very conspicuous, and part of how she could do the work she did is she made herself invisible. I mean, she learned to really move through spaces, and she could sort of dim herself. She actually wore kind of baggy clothes to de-emphasize her female body. And so this is in the book, I ascribe it to Caroline's teachings, a way of holding yourself is really what Caroline is teaching her. Um, not um, Not sort of engaging in those looks that she gets as she moves through San Francisco with all those
Right.
eyes on her. Yeah.
Right. So early on in her career in San Francisco, because she learns sort of that trick and realizes that she doesn't necessarily want to be seen and learns the advantages of not being seen early on when she's in San Francisco. Fast forward to towards the end of the book, which is later in her career when she starts going out into the street, she leaves behind or does less photo work or studio work, portrait work, and starts doing more field on the street sort of photography. And
Mhm.
she learns that whereas before, and I'll just use the quote again here, when I was younger, quote, when I was younger, I wanted to walk in the world as if I were invisible. But slowly I came to realize you couldn't really see people if you're bent on hiding all the time. So what at one point had given her freedom now becomes sort of an obstacle to her work. So
Yeah.
can you speak to sort of that, how she comes to that realization and how that kind of affects how she moves forward?
Yeah. I mean, so she was hyper visible. She couldn't, everywhere Dorothea Lange went when she was photographing the Japanese internment in the 1942, all eyes were on her. People were always saying, "Who's that woman? Who's that woman?" And I think she realized that she wouldn't be able to make herself invisible, but also, as you're saying, that it was an advantage specifically in establishing a connection with people. So she moved quickly through spaces, but she was somehow able very quickly to establish a kind of empathy or connection with her subjects. And and for that she had to be present, she had to be visible to people. And so she would actually, after having hidden her leg for many years, her limp, she would go into for example, the pea pickers camp, the famous
Hmm.
migrant mother.
Hmm.
And she says how she wouldn't hide that because she knew that making herself seen would render her more approachable to her subjects, that they could be more vulnerable, that they could bring themselves And a photograph is that encounter, right? So making herself seen then allows them to draw themselves out and show themselves to her.
Right. She says, another quote that I loved related to this theme was, she says, "You had to show people who you were if you hoped they'd show you something of themselves." So there's this notion, sort of, you don't get something for nothing, right? I have to be vulnerable to you in order for you to be vulnerable to me. And that, of course, is going to translate to her work. So I loved that. She also says, even more than the desire, so she's talking about portraiture now, even more than the desire to be admired, what people wanted and so seldom got was to be seen. So, why do you think it's such a fundamental need and desire to be seen, and also something that oftentimes for us is so hard to achieve? Such a fundamental need that we have such difficulty in actually getting satisfied.
Yeah. I think we all hunger to be seen for who we are and appreciated for who we are. There's also a terror, right, in showing yourself as vulnerable, as showing yourself as who you authentically are. So I think if it weren't as charged, it wouldn't be um, that that gratifying when someone finally does see you, when finally someone knows who you are. It's so profound, and I think she felt in her work that people were waiting, that they were ready, and they hadn't maybe had the chance before, that no one had approached them with, as you're saying, their own vulnerability or the curiosity or the deep attention that would invite that out of them.
Right.
But that people want that.
Right. She mentions that the migrant workers, she had the sense that sometimes they had waited years to
Yeah,
tell their story,
yeah,
which is just so poignant and, just sort of heartbreaking on the one hand, but also beautiful on the other, because she's able to do that for them, right?
yeah.
And we're able to do that oftentimes as writers and artists and musicians. So I loved the exploration of that theme.
Mhm.
So let's change gears again here. Part and parcel of the racial issues that we already talked about is xenophobia. The xenophobia that's so pervasive during the time in which this story is taking place, again, the 1920s, after World War I. And what was so striking to me as I was reading about the xenophobia in this story is this astonishing sense of history repeating itself. And this, just like the what we just got done talking about relative to being seen and not seen, this is another theme, history repeating itself, that just comes up over and over again. And you're reading this book and it's like, it's just very powerful. So, but let's start, and there are other ways in which history repeats itself, but let's start with the xenophobia. So can you tell us what was going on in the 1920s in San Francisco, in the States, that is, and how it's similar to what we're dealing with today?
I mean, that's such a massive question, but I'll try. I'm not a historian, but, but
No pressure, no pressure.
I'll do my best. I mean, there was a very large immigrant population at the time. And for the first time in American history, the immigrants were coming from the southern regions of Europe, from Italy, from Eastern Europe. And there were also many people coming from China, of course, Japan. And so as America is now exiting World War One, there's a intensifying sense of, there always is, I think, after a war, this nationalist sort of feeling is in the air. And in defining America, you have a contingent who's bent on defining America as white. Yeah. And the immigration laws that are put into place, specifically, as I was talking about, you know, put into place with the Chinese in mind, is a way of actually controlling that identity and assuring a certain version of America that will be what triumphs. And it worked. I mean, those laws were in place until the 1960s. There were immigration quotas based on race into the 1960s, and I think that it unfortunately it's if you're an immigrant, this story is not unfamiliar, not strange to you at all.
Right, right,
I came as an immigrant in the 1970s. My family came, and we also really struggled with immigration status and so forth. But it does feel horrifyingly familiar after what we have just experienced in the last. I think the last 4 years have really amplified what were already, quite quite noxious strains of racism and xenophobia.
Right.
They were sort of enlivened by the rhetoric that was issuing from the
Sort
president.
of, sort of enlivened.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so, I wasn't sort of I didn't go into this project with a certain kind of agenda, but you could not notice that the rhetoric was terrifyingly familiar.
Right.
That the Muslim ban, which impacted my community, the Iranian community, was absolutely born of those immigration restrictions that emerged in the 1920s. So history does repeat itself, and I think in telling it you have to encounter the present and think about how can this story hopefully maybe partly intercede.
Absolutely.
Right?
Right.
How can we use fiction and use storytelling to show the consequences? In 1920, that kind of untrammeled, rhetoric, that xenophobia and nationalism that was unleashed had horrific consequences for people. The brutal, we would call them now hate crimes that came out of that era were the result of this unchecked xenophobia.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So much more there. But let's switch from xenophobia to another, again, just another example of history repeating itself in startling parallel, which is there's a pandemic going on
Yeah.
during this period. And it's not just, and that's not where it stops. The specific how we react and the attitudes that arise during the pandemic in the 20s, such a startling parallel to, again, what we've just gone through the past year. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. That was very strange because when I started writing the novel in, I guess it's 2017, no one was predicting, well, really it was not on our minds.
Only experts who were being ignored were predicting it. Nobody else had any idea.
Most
Right.
of us were not thinking
Right.
about it. And so I always knew I would have to write about the pandemic, but then when we began to live through one, I realized that this wouldn't have been just in the background of their lives. It stopped everything. And particularly artists were, there was terrible fallout for everybody, but there was an economic fallout and that hit the artistic community really hard. And so having lived through it, then I could really imagine. I could really imagine how frightening it was at that time. And you also had people who didn't believe in taking precautions. You had exactly the same responses to the mask.
Because people were wearing masks. First of all, people had to wear masks then, just like today. And then, like you just said, some people didn't want to wear them. So they had that whole, I mean, the level of detail to which
Including
the
the mayor.
parallels, including the mayor.
Including the mayor. The mayor himself was often seen without his mask on at boxing matches. I mean, he was a really, kind of he was an outrageous character anyway. But there was this kind of baffling, mind-boggling disrespect for those precautions, even from the top levels of
Right.
the
Did he have dinner at French Laundry at any point during? I don't remember that in the book. I don't know if that happened. I don't know if the French Laundry was around yet in the 1920s. But another quick thing related to the pandemic that I just want to touch on because it's such a striking parallel is that there was a particular group of people who were scapegoated
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
20s, just like today. And that, of course, again,
Yeah, and the bubonic plague had come to San Francisco. So there was an earlier precursor in 1901. The plague had come to San
oh,
Francisco. And at that time, Chinatown was in quarantine. That whole quarter of the city was put on lockdown. Nobody else in the city, right? Only that, because the presumption was it was the foreign Chinese body that had imported this evil. And so absolutely there was a precedent for that, and at the time there was a lot of anxiety about the racialized body and the ways that it was literally infecting San Francisco and the
right.
country.
Right. So just a few other examples of history repeating itself, which we don't have time to go into, but again, just to sort of drive this point home, because, I'm just reading and it's, like I said, it was just so powerful. Fake news. There's a quote, "It was exhausting to follow the news when it didn't turn your stomach. The exaggeration and misinformation drove you crazy. Again, you could have written that last week. But there's also homelessness, a refugee crises, floods and fires. There's so much. And so it begs the question, and this is a sort of a question for all times, but since your book raises it, I'm going to ask you anyway.
Mhm.
Do we learn nothing from history? I mean, that's what was kept coming up for me. It's like, how many times do we have to go through similar experiences to not have to go through them again? So what are your thoughts as you're writing this book, and you didn't know about the pandemic, for example, or at least you didn't know the parallels, and it's just like you said, you didn't set out to draw these parallels, they just came up. So
Mhm.
what are you thinking about what we do or do not learn from history, especially as someone in the humanities, right? It's like, maybe we need to increase the funding for the humanities instead of continuing to decrease it. But anyway, I digress. Just thoughts on that, on what we do or do not learn from history?
I mean, it's been said so many times by so many very astute minds that we don't have much use for history in the United States. And actually, your point about history programs or the teaching of history is they've shrunken radically. Many institutions that were renowned for the liberal arts and for the study of history have just shrunken down. And so, yes, I think the teaching of history that it absolutely is still a compromise story that we get, if we get it at all. I grew up, I had a fairly good public school education. I had never heard about the discrimination against the Chinese. I never heard about the Japanese internment. And I went to good schools, but it simply
Here
was
in San Francisco, no
in
less,
in the
right?
Bay Area. Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
right.
It was not taught. I think one thing that has changed, and I'm just going to grasp for hope where I can, is that the storytellers are more diverse now.
Hmm.
That now you have women telling stories, and you have people of color telling their stories. And I don't know that they are yet heard in the ways that they should be heard, but I think they're changing the story. I think that we're paying attention to stories that when I was growing up were very, very peripheral to the main story. And because people can do things like they can have podcasts, and the tools are in people's hands, and that's exciting. And I think that's actually something Dorothea Lange would absolutely have endorsed. I think
Right.
certain aspects of our current culture would have horrified her, but the
She
ways
would
that
have loved podcasts, though.
she would
She
have
would have
loved podcasts.
absolutely loved podcasts. Yeah.
Yeah, but the ways that with a cell phone we can document social vi- violence against communities of
Injustice
color.
and
Yeah, I think that would have been extraordinarily powerful. She would have really seen the power of that. We cannot look away. I think when you have people now, all of us have that, that tool in our hands, and it has changed what we see and what counts as important.
right,
So,
right. So let's talk about that tool not being the cell phone, but the camera in her time, and something that was a fairly bright spot, sort of in her experience, which was she's a woman photographer in the 20s, which we would have thought, okay, that can't be a particularly ideal time to be a woman photographer, and it wasn't necessarily, and yet San Francisco, nonetheless, was actually sort of a decent place to be a woman photographer, which was really interesting. So can you speak to being a woman photographer in her time and specific to even in San Francisco?
right. So Dorothea Lange had come from the East Coast, where Alfred Stieglitz had a chokehold on modern photography, and he did
Right.
not promote many women. Now, Lange didn't think of herself as an artist at that time at all. She was, over a decade away from thinking that. But when she came to California, she came to a place where there was not the same kind of established male-dominated photography community, in part because many of them had left after the earthquake and fires that created.
Cowards, those cowards.
Well, I mean, there was no city, there was no work for them. Dorothea Lange's mentor went back to New York. There were people who went down to Carmel. That's when you see the beginning of an artist colony down in Carmel. But essentially that vacuum created a space where women could enter. And so Dorothea Lange came in at a time, she wasn't the only one. And that's to me really interesting, because
Right.
we somehow we only ever think that that she's, she was sort of sui generis and she never worked with anyone. But there was a really dynamic group of women photographers working in San Francisco, among them Imogen Cunningham, Consuela Kanaga, who are characters in the book. And they really lift each other up. Contrary to most narratives we hear about women and women artists, they were a community and they really supported one another.
I love that. So let's go from, or let's go further then and continue talking about creativity, both related to Dorothea's experience and her story, but also in general. I also want to hear from Jasmin about her creative process. So we already talked a little bit about how early on, or for most of her career in the story at least, she's in the studio, and then later on she starts taking photographs in the street and in the field. How did her process change when she left the studio and went out into the field?
Well, she had exclusively photographed in the studio until 1932. That's the beginning of when she goes out into the streets. The correlation is the Depression.
Right.
She sees the fallout of the Dust Bowl out on the San Francisco streets. In the studio, you control everything. You can control the lighting. It's within your domain, and I think as an artist, that's terrifically useful, that you can control a lot of the elements in there. Not everything, but she could create an environment. She could make people comfortable. She could adjust the lighting and pose them in a certain way. Going out into the streets meant opening herself to all kinds of uncertainties and unpredictabilities. She was a woman. She worked with a very heavy camera, so there was no hiding it. Going back to our conversation about being seen,
Right.
Going out with that huge camera made her extremely visible to people as she was walking through town. She had to find a way to be comfortable, to sort of, gain a certain confidence in herself. It's still at a time in history where women were not they were not in the public sphere, so you just have to imagine a woman of relatively diminutive stature carrying this huge camera around,
Limping all the while, by the way.
limping all the
Right.
while, right?
Right.
And so I think she did it and did it and did it, and I think she went from feeling unsteady and unsure to having some sense of confidence out in the streets, and also having, I think, increasing willingness to make art out of what is there.
Right.
Right.
Right. And so you mentioned risk and uncertainty, given that she's no longer in the studio and it's a whole different world. And she says, quote, "Each time I went out, I had no idea what was going to happen." Right. This is exactly what we're talking about. Each time I went out, I had no idea what was going to happen. Taking pictures on the street was different from work in the studio, but I knew to trust my eye. So I love this notion of trusting ourselves as part of the creative process. So my question for you is, what role does trusting, going with your gut, trusting your intuition, or even faith have in your creative process?
It's tremendous. Without it, nothing really. I can't imagine any story. I I never know where I'm going to go. I work on intuition. You can never predict. I don't think anyone can predict what story will do well. Most of what I've written has been predicted to not do well.
Uh-huh.
You know,
Well,
I,
those naysayers, they've been shamed. So yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's just a pull you feel. I think Dorothea Lange felt it. It's just a pull that you feel toward a person, a situation. It is, it's absolutely a matter of trusting the wisdom of your curiosity, right? That's
Mhm.
the sum of so much knowledge inside of you. Your curiosity is a kind of compass. And so that's how I work, absolutely, as a writer. I did not know. I mean, all I had was a building and a woman with no name. you
Right.
know?
Right. Right.
Right. And so you go to the desk or the computer day after day, and each day maybe a few more words of the puzzle, pieces of the puzzle reveal themselves, right? But
Right.
that's also the pleasure, is
Yes.
that you
Yes.
don't know.
Right.
You don't know. You don't know
Right.
where it's going to take you. It has a life of its own. And I think in the most ideal circumstances, you feel yourself in service to something bigger than you.
And she speaks exactly to that point, which is the next thing I was going to ask you about. She says, so she's taken the white angel breadline pick, which everyone has probably seen this. You might not know it, but as soon as you see it, you're like, oh, that's the white angel breadline pick. It becomes iconic. Well, she's just taken this picture in the story, and someone asked her, I don't remember who it was. They say, what are you going to do with that picture? Because it's different. It's sort of groundbreaking, and they're not seeing it as that. They're just sort of seeing it as this sort of different sort of picture. And she says, I didn't have the slightest idea. I only knew that I would go out again tomorrow and the day after that. So, thoughts on creating, kind of going a little bit further with what you just said, this notion of we just create and we kind of let ourselves go with that creative current. And we might be creating something iconic. We might be writing a bestseller, but we don't necessarily have any idea that that's what we're doing. And it also doesn't matter. So can you kind of speak to just throwing yourself into the creative process like that without knowing? She didn't know, right? She's just, I have no idea. I just know I was going to go out again tomorrow and keep doing it.
Mhm. We don't know. She didn't know when she was taking those photographs. I don't, maybe some part of her hope she was taking something that somebody would care about, but I don't I don't think that even late into her life she ever felt assured that what she was photographing was going to impact people in that way, so but that's her genius, is that I think that's her genius, is that she stuck with it.
Mhm.
She didn't know, but she did it anyway.
Right, right. She also observed something in Maynard Dixon, who was her husband for quite a
Mhm.
while. He starts working on a painting called Forgotten Man. And she says, I thought it was the best work he'd ever done. After looking at it for a long time, I understood something I'd never really seen. How he'd been withholding some vital part of himself as an artist, that as much as he'd given to his paintings, he'd erased himself from them too. So what does it mean? We hear sort of talk about this, but what does it mean to give ourselves or even all of ourselves to our work? And is it essential if we're going to have success with whatever it is that we might be creating?
Yeah, I mean, that is such a good and very interesting question. What part of yourself you make accessible, what has to be accessible. Um, I think that I mean, when she was looking at Maynard Dixon, her husband's painting, she realized that for him, art had been, not always, but mostly an escape from reality. And I think what she's also saying is that if you're not connected to the world, you're not connected to your art, or your art isn't fully alive unless it intersects in some way with the world. And I think maybe that's what she was getting at when she was looking at Maynard Dixon's previous paintings, is thinking that for him, art had been a, a way of absenting himself from his life, as beautiful as they are, right? And I mean, he's an extraordinary artist, and is still, I think his paintings are just exquisite. They're
Right,
divine. Yeah.
right.
But she felt, and that was an argument between them, that it was a longstanding argument between them, is that he, as an artist, did not want to be part of, modernization of the, commerce. It all really offended him. And he
Hmm.
wanted to move to New Mexico and be away from all of that. And she felt that for her, being an artist meant staying in those streets and seeing what she saw and being part of San Francisco's story.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, in the two of them, you get these very different ideas of what an artist is and what she can give.
Right. How do you know, Jasmine specifically, how do you know where to draw the line insofar as sharing yourself? I've been struggling with this. I've just finished the first draft of a memoir, and I was just talking with a friend last night. There's something that I just don't know. I don't know if I want to share it or not. And I don't know if the story is going to be less if I don't share it. And I was sort of having an argument like you were just describing between Dorothea and Maynard about you should, no, you shouldn't. And where is that line? So how do your first book was a memoir, but even when you're writing historical fiction, there's still a lot of ourselves, obviously, in the work, whether it's nonfiction or not. So where do you find that line? And do you ever notice, I do need to go there. I kind of don't want to go there because it's a risk, because maybe I'm making myself vulnerable, but the work needs it. How do you find that line?
I think what the work needs is what you must do. That's what you're there for. I think that's what you're there for as an artist, as a writer. You have to tell the things you probably wouldn't even tell, a good friend. Maybe you wouldn't tell a good friend, but it's almost, I think, your sacred obligation as an artist to tell
Mhm.
those things that you can't even say to most people in your life. And I think it's actually, for me, writing fiction has allowed me to go deeper and tell more about myself. You probably can find more of me in the Bohemians than you can in The Good Daughter. Partly, it's the veil of fiction.
Right.
um, but it's also, I think you're also then within yourself, you have a certain freedom, that the fictional sort of container is going to protect you in some way,
Right.
right, emotionally. And I'm not as worried. I really am not as worried about what people think. It's more that it is scary.
Mhm.
It's scary to say, for example, I mean, something that is very really resonates with me with Dorothea is this terror she had of having her body, seen. Yeah.
Right.
As a Middle Eastern woman, this is something that really resonates. But I found a way in fiction, in somebody else's life, to explore that and show it.
I love that. I love that. Thank you.
Mhm.
So let's talk about historical fiction. And I want to start specifically, and I want to start with a quote that you have at the very beginning of the book by Herb Caen, which is, quote, "San Francisco isn't what it used to be, and it never was,"
Yeah.
which I love. But can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think we imagine, we romanticize. San Francisco has undergone such a radical change just in the last 20 years, even the last 10 years. And for me, when I found this reference to a place called Monkey Block, it sounded like a fairy tale. A San Francisco with an artist colony in the middle of the financial district, not possible. Right?
Not today.
It's
Although I think commercial real estate is going to be a lot cheaper, but yeah, in the last 10 years, certainly hard to conceive of that. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. But I think we romanticize the past, and partly I think what Herb Caen is saying is that, there's no there there. There never was a perfect San Francisco. Um, San Francisco has made many compromises. It has given away parts of its soul again and again, and it has survived. But in looking back, there is a value, I think, in looking back, is that you can think about what you might want to preserve, right? But we shouldn't only look back in a nostalgic sense,
Right.
right? Because I
Right.
think that that's dangerous too.
Right.
Definitely.
So let's talk about the past and recreating the past. So when I finished my novel, a friend said to me, "God, I can't imagine actually finishing a novel that's so great." And I sort of have a similar reaction to finishing a historical fiction, in the sense that just recreating the past seems so daunting. And I mean, of course, I can rationalize, well, you just go do a bunch of research and you learn about the past, and you create it. But it still seems really daunting to me. So can you talk about just a little bit your process? Like, you do a bunch of research. How do you know when you've done enough research? How do you know which research is, credible or relevant to the story you want to tell? Just kind of give us an overview of that high, because again, I'm sure this could be a whole hour, but just a high level overview of your process.
Sure. So I love to research. So that part of it is actually not as troublesome as the writing.
Right, right.
And if I could only research, I probably would.
Uh-huh.
But
Okay.
to me, it's just so delicious. I love that period where you're just, finding that world and beginning to imagine its contours and so forth. So I think the best materials I find are not in the broad histories, they're in the smaller histories, the stories that well, a lot of biographies were very useful to me, memoirs, any kind of account from that time. And not even, I think, even better if it's not a well-known personage.
Hmm.
The more obscure stories tend to have more texture and sort of interesting dimension for me.
Hmm.
So it's a lot to do with instinct, it's a lot to do with, you start with the one book and it's just this wondrous rabbit hole of an adventure. I find that one book is leading to the next one. I am very interested um, in finding in creating, at least in my mind, a kind of theoretical framework for the book. So with Dorothea Lange's work, I was thinking a lot about identity, and I was thinking about women's bodies, and of course, I was thinking about immigration and xenophobia, but things. So I do read some political theory. I read I read history because I want, for me, that's, I think the excitement of the story is when you put that in that smaller story of one person's life, when you situate that within something bigger.
Right.
That, for me, the magic of historical fiction.
Right.
And I want that framework in my head as I'm choosing what to put in this world. I want a sense of the stakes,
Right. Right.
the bigger story.
Do you ever worry about getting it wrong? So I just published a book for a client that is historical fiction. It's her grandmother's story,
Yeah.
and she was such a diligent researcher. I mean, she, 6 years and talked with all these experts, traveled around the country. I mean, really, really did her homework. And yet we had an event with a historical association, and of course some of those people were able to say, well, that's not right, that's not right. And it was minor stuff, but she's a perfectionist, and so we went back and we updated the book to address those concerns. So it seems like inevitably there's going to be one or two things
Yeah.
that come up. So do you worry about getting it wrong, getting it wrong, and what do you do to ensure, to the extent possible, that you don't?
Right. So, and you had asked earlier about or I want to address this, is I think at a certain point you do have to stop researching, and it's
Hmm.
sort of like, what's good enough? How
Right.
much is enough? I just
Right.
need enough. I don't need everything to get going. And so I actually then put, the books aside, and I'm very focused on the writing, and I keep lists of things that I need to research, but I try not to do that for a while so that the story can start to breathe and to find a life of its own. Yeah.
Right.
And then you're rigorous. You do your best. You go in, and then when you're revising the work, I'm still also reading a lot. In the case of San Francisco, unlike Iran, I mean, I wasn't as worried about Iran because people know less about Iran.
Right. Right. Right.
But
Right.
San Francisco history people are really serious, and I did know that in writing a book about San Francisco, I would have to contend with this band of experts out there who knew so much more about history. I'm not a historian. People who have spent their lives learning about San Francisco's
Right.
story. So you do your best, and I think for me, I try to pick a diverse, sort of um, a first round of readers for myself.
Hmm.
So if I can, I'll find a friend who's a historian of the period, or um, people from different. I had people who were photographers. I don't know. I'm not a photographer. I had to make sure that I was getting those details right
Sure.
too. So enlisting the help of people who have superior knowledge is very important. And then I have to say, I have a crack team of copy editors
Hmm.
who I don't know how they do it, and it feels like torture when I'm going through it, and I probably resent it a lot of the time, but they catch things. I mean, they're very at Random House. They're really rigorous, and I have, oh my gosh, many many times over, I am indebted to their, you know, um, unwavering eye.
Right. Right. So that's kind of how you find what to include. How do you, and maybe it's actually the same answer, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. How do you decide what to leave out? So for example, Dorothea's brother was there when she took the White Angel
Yeah,
breadline photograph, but you didn't include him there. You would have
right.
had to bring him to San Francisco and all of that. So that was just one example that stood out for me. How do you choose what not to include? And like I said, it might be the answer you just gave to the previous question, but any other thoughts on that?
Where I land on this is, whatever I do, whether it's inventing something or subtracting something from the story, it has to feel consonant with the truth, right? So Dorothea's brother being there, it's important, but it's not absolutely essential to that story. And so I didn't feel, particular, I didn't feel particularly compromised by that
Right.
decision.
Right.
Um, but it's very, very tricky. When you're writing historical fiction, it's not history. In fact, I started out saying is you have to bring something to the story, and where you start and where you stop, that's very complicated. So I don't tell Dorothea Lange's whole life, because there's a perfectly robust biography of Dorothea Lange. And
Right.
for those interested, they can go there, right? But I try to, I guess I try to be consonant with what is there, and then I am honoring what I think I can bring to the story.
Right. You told the story in first person. I can't remember if Song of Captive Bird, was that also in first person? I
Yeah,
can't
it
remember.
was.
Okay. So tell me why that choice? Why did you choose to tell it in first person, in Dorothea's voice?
I think in writing historical fiction, somehow you have to close the divide between the present and the past. Even though 100 years ago isn't that far, something about the first person collapses that divide or makes it feel a little bit less large.
Hmm.
And so the first I chose to get closer, also because the first to me, it almost serves as a vehicle for me to act or step into her persona or to begin to inhabit her as a character as an actor would. So it might be exactly the same material, but something about saying I lets me access the emotion in a moment and kind of strangely paradoxically bring myself closer to the subject who is not me.
And that is, you fell into my trap, because that's my question really is, tell me about, because I would think, and you just said this, that particularly in first person, but even in third person, but even more so undoubtedly in first person, that's got to make your relationship with this character, who in this case was a real life person, that much more intimate. And so I'm curious about that intimacy that develops, especially, I don't know how many years, 2 or 3 or even 4 years that it took you to write this book. Um, but you're in right, you're living this person's life. You're in first person, writing in her voice. I have two examples that I'll cite that are just really interesting to me. One is actually the same author that I just mentioned, Nancy Hardesty. She wrote the Bonnet Book, which is this historical fiction book that I published. And she talks, when we do events, she always shares how at times she felt as if her grandmother, again, it's her grandmother's story, was,
Mm.
writing through her pen. I just interviewed Natalie Bazile, who has an interview in her upcoming anthology, We Are Each Other's Harvest, where Lalita Tatamy talks about how she had one of her characters in her book sort of haunting her essentially and saying, look, you're not getting, and I think it was a fiction book, you're not getting the story right. And the character wouldn't let up until she got the story right. I have another friend, dear friend, who's a writer, who her characters will show up and she'll know that it's time to write. So I just find it so fascinating, this relationship that we can have, even with fictional characters, whether they're nonfiction. So any thoughts on that, on the intimacy that can develop when we're spending so much time retelling these stories, inhabiting these characters, like you said, almost as if we're actors. Any additional thoughts on that? I just find it so fascinating.
I think this is why you have to choose your characters carefully because your relationship with them is probably going to be the most intense and intimate of your life during the time that you're writing.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
my husband could probably vouch for this, is that I was in a closer relationship with Dorothea than I was, and I miss her so much now, and I miss Caroline too, is I feel like they're, my closest, my people are gone now, and the only cure for that really is to write another book and find another.
Right, right. But your husband's like, honey, can you just take a couple months off? I miss you.
It's
I miss
intense.
you. Dorothea finally left. I finally have you back. Just give me a month or two.
No, it's a real issue. It really is an issue, and I am writing a new book now, or I had been until it gets a little complicated when you have a book launching.
Right.
But you have to be in a place where you can surrender to that. Yeah, I sometimes say it's like moving to another planet, and that is not necessarily where your loved ones want you to be.
Right.
And and it's not even just the hours, it's the hours that you're working, which can be a lot of hours, but it's your full, part of me is always not quite in this world and in the other one, and that's actually essential for me.
Right.
my
Right.
for my functioning is, that's how I survive, is by absenting myself at least partly. But that it can be really hard for those around you, and it can also be very wearing on you. I mean, particularly if you're writing about characters who endure traumas, as I have, is that, you are actually, I think you're taking it into your body as you're writing it. To make it any good, I think you're taking it into your body
Right.
and into your dreams and into your relationships. And so it can feel quite heavy,
Right.
quite heavy. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Last question in the interest of time. I just thought, again, since we are a writers' conference, I just thought it would be interesting, and you're a professor, so you teach this stuff. Any sort of parting words of advice for writers who are starting, particularly in historical fiction, on how they might want to approach that, particularly, like I said, if they're just getting started? Any sort of parting words of advice?
I think going back to our conversation about your instinct, I mean, uh, the things that you wonder about and worry about and you're curious about, that's where it's at, right? And the weirder the better, probably. It really is about, trusting that that's your compass, the weird and the messy, the strange things that fascinate you, that preoccupy you. Probably that's what you should be writing into and about more, right?
I think you were on my text exchange last night with my friend that I mentioned. That is exactly the conversation we just had. So thank you for that. Thanks for that validation. I thought we were talking for, other writers getting started, but I think that message was actually for me. So thank you for that. And thanks for being here today, Jasmin. I loved the book. I loved our conversation. So thanks for making the time today. And yes, why don't you do you have the book? Do you want to show the book?
I do, and I think it really is very beautiful. It's a young woman walking with a camera. It's the San Francisco skyline behind her, and it's a strange time to launch a book, and yet
And yet it's going to be a massive success. So
it's
there you
all
have it.
so nice to talk to you. I feel like we could still talk for many more hours.
We could, and we will at the next opportunity that we have. For now, though, let me say thanks again, and let me tell everyone the Bohemians is out April 6th. That's still the case.
Yes.
April 6th. For more about the book and for more about Jasmin, go to jasmindarznik.com. I'm Matthew Felix. For more about me, matthewfelix.com. And of course, for more about the San Francisco Writers Conference, including details about the this year's new expanded writing competition and lots of upcoming virtual events, that is all at sfwriters.org. Thanks again, Jasmin. The Bohemians is out April 6th. And until next time, thanks for joining us.